This is for discussion, additional discussion, and I believe, did we have, Kendall, was there some folks who wanted to talk a little bit more about that here?
Yeah, I think, Doug, were you going to present what you learned?
I'm happy to.
Document.
Please do, Doug. Why don't you let us know what we've got going, and then if someone else would like to
We were looking at what was in our code already, because they pointed out that what Steve mentioned, that we already kind of organized it, or it was at least in the...
Yeah, Steve provided me this.
Okay.
I had no idea that this existed. It was done when I wasn't in my current position, but Title 16 in Chapter 32 refers to the Wasatch Open Lands Board, and they are intended to be involved in transfer development rights, fees in lieu of open space, and how that they will be spent, prioritizing open space. And the interlocal agreement, this says draft on it, so I don't know if it was ever enacted.
I don't think it was ever enacted.
But in short, what it
So would we consider this kind of a draft or a model or a
discussion to see if this is something we want to present now, or do we want to modify it in some way, or...
So is this
If this
currently in the code or not?
Huh?
Is this currently in the code or not?
Well, it's 1632.
The 1632 is, but this was designed as an interlocal agreement on how that board was going to function. And the code refers to it.
Yeah. This is not in the code, but Title 16 refers to the Wasatch Open Lands Board.
Okay, but it would never be in the code, right? We would create that.
Yeah, you can create that as part of the interlocal agreement.
Okay.
So what it envisioned is 7 members, 2 appointed by the council, and then 1 from each city in the county. And they would be voting members on the board to determine where funds are spent, what are priorities. It also envisioned a full-time staff member that would be over would be staff for the Wasatch Open Lands Board and organizing all the money and purchase of open lands. And then along with that, there was a not less than 9 citizen board that consisted of a public planning official, real estate agents, 3 members of an agricultural community / landowner, representatives from the natural resources community, an attorney, and then citizens at large, a representative from a civic organization, and an open space or land conservation organization representative. So they would be non-voting members.
This is under B, the non-voting citizen advisory.
Right.
And the voting members would be those listed above. 2 county, 1 Heber, 1 Midway, 1 Wallsburg, 1 Daniel, 1 Charleston.
Yeah.
And that, if we were to do something like that, that would now have to be expanded to include
I got independent,
high down in the centers.
maybe in the law. I don't know.
Well, that's a city.
Oh,
Yeah.
right.
Or town.
But it also
Yeah.
provides, sorry, Steve, it also provides for decisions on bonding revenues too.
Okay, thank you, Doug. Any questions or comments for Doug, or where do we want to? If not, we'll see.
Well, I think we just want to open this up to discussion and see if this is something we want to go ahead, or we want to modify it, or it was presented last week that we were to do an open space bond, and we want to try and figure the mechanism of how to go about it, and what to identify and how to go about the bonding.
So did we vote? I wasn't here, I'm sorry. So
We voted to, well, let's see, Spencer made the motion, and we voted to pursue an open space bond, and that this would be the first avenue we would look at as a mechanism for driving that, whether it's in 2017 or 2018.
But we don't know how much or what.
No, we were going to use the open space bond to,
These board, oh.
either this mechanism or a different mechanism. We'll try to come up with that.
Pointed out that this was kind of semi-organized, or had been suggested way back.
You know, it's actually foolish for the county to do a bond if we can't get the municipalities involved with this. It's gotta be an overall countywide effort. And that's why this interlocal agreement gets it all in the same.
Was this all written out back then, and
So are they aware that they may have forgotten about it, but they should be aware of it?
And represented to them. Yeah.
It's been long enough, you might have a whole different group. of
Yeah,
people.
that's what I was thinking. That was like, is this when we did the TDRs, like '07? Probably like '07?
No, that's probably 04.
well, it was back
It's
when,
dated on here 07.
07.
Yeah, I think I was on the planning commission, if I remember right, when it came through. Anyway, okay, so do we want to, I mean, obviously we can't vote today, this is a work meeting, but is it understood that we want to try and present this or constitute this? Is that what we're
Well, I should open it up for discussion.
discussion for anyone to?
Yeah.
Would anyone like
And I
to come?
think we have Wendy Fisher here and Tracy. They've been working with a committee for the last 2 years on looking at the North Fields as a possibility.
So I'm Wendy Fisher, I'm with the Utah Open Lands, and actually I've been to the county several times. I've been with Utah Open Lands for 27 years, and I've worked to preserve open space throughout the state. And I actually have done a lot of research with respect to how open space bonds work well. And one of the things that we've worked on as a committee with some of the folks here in Wasatch County is the idea of how do you get your biggest bang for your buck. And I think that what we've looked at is there are things that you can do in setting up a committee, in setting up how you would move forward on this sort of open space bond and the execution of the actual dollars that can actually maximize the leveraging that whatever you would bond for could actually accomplish for the county. So let me give you a couple of examples of what we've seen right now. There is the state Leroy McAllister Fund that was put in place in 1999-2000, that part of the stipulation that they have is that they will only fund 50% of a project.
I didn't think that's been funded for about the last 10 years.
Actually, it was about 3 years that it was not funded. There was continuing funds in that, and then this last year, they did receive $500,000 that went into the fund, and right about now, they have about $650,000. I think what we're looking at is, when I started working for Utah Open Lands, there were no open space bonds anywhere. There wasn't one in Park City, there wasn't one in Summit County, there wasn't one in Draper, there wasn't one in Salt Lake County. And there are federal tax incentives that exist that are actually better tax incentives today than they were back in 1990. So that's another way that you can leverage some of those dollars. But yes, with respect to the statewide fund, the Leroy McAllister Fund, what we've seen is that growth is cyclical. You have boom and bust, so to speak, or you have up and down periods. Probably in 2007, when this was written, we were in a pretty heightened state of economic development and in terms of growth. Similarly, when the Leroy McAllister Fund was envisioned, we've gone through a number of studies down at the legislature through the mid-90s when we were experiencing a lot of growth here in the state. And so what we look at in terms of open space is it's a long-term game. And it's really about how do we improve the quality of life in the community by protecting some of these various different areas, whether they're agricultural lands, recreational lands, scenic open space, various different values. But I think critically, from my perspective, there's a good way to do this and a way that's going to be less valuable from a monetary perspective, to be that crass, quite frankly. There are ways that you can put in place the structure for the committee and how you're going to go about selecting the projects that you're going to fund that can be advantageous because it will enable you to benefit from the federal tax incentives, from NRCS. Working with the committee with Tracy and a number of other folks, we've actually started talking with NRCS, which is the Natural Resource Conservation Service, which is part of the federal Farm Bill program, and they have a lot of funding that they put out for agricultural land preservation. The reason that we think that it's important to have actually funding from a local community to be able to go forward and match those is in order to even apply for the NRCS funds, you actually have to have matching funds in hand. You have to have a local or a state program. And exactly what you were saying, Steve, because there were years when we didn't have that state program. There was one year that Utah gave $3 million back that could have been put into agricultural preservation. So what I'm looking at is however you structure your board, however you decide to put it together, how do I say this? The rules of the road in terms of how you're going to make grants can help to leverage that money that you would put into bonding 3 times over if you do it correctly, because you can include the tax incentives there and you can include funding from other sources.
Seems like everything you're saying though would be after the fact, after the bond's already been approved by the voters. Later, or is there something?
How could you approve a bond if you didn't know what you were buying?
No,
You have to identify them.
No, what I'm saying is, what she's talking about is for matching.
Well, there are a couple of different things, and I think both of those are good questions. There are some open space bonds that are put forward where you don't know necessarily what you're going to bond, what you're going to buy, but you know what you're bonding for. You're bonding for agricultural preservation, bonding for recreational corridor.
So it must be a lot different than the bonds we've done in the past, because we've had to know to the dollar how much a project was going to cost, or...
Yes and no. This is just a broader approach. You define a lot of options, essentially, is what you do in this. When we bond for something, we're specifically doing a building or a
Yeah, if it's a building or
project
something
or
like...
something. This gives you, it does allow to give you a menu, so to speak, of potential things you would be doing, and you would identify by priority areas you would look at from a priority standpoint. And then when they become available, it might not be number one that comes available first.
So if I'm a voter going to the ballot box to vote on whether or not I'm going to write a check out on my taxes to pay for open space, I don't know how much or where or what property use, or I do. It's a list of a menu list.
You do an amount, for sure.
I was going to say you have to know exactly what the amount is, correct?
You do have to know exactly what the amount is, and you're also going to look at that in terms of what is that going to generate for an individual. In other words, am I going to have to spend $10 a year, or am I going to have to spend $50 a year in order to do whatever that bond is? And what we've seen in other communities is that oftentimes will help to set what that actual bond amount is going to be based on what the threshold of that amount is. Some people can say, well, I can forego, my breakfast meal once a week or something like that out of a restaurant, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to put that money, the $10 or whatever, into paying for the bond. So that oftentimes determines it. But as has been said, one of the things that's really critical from this perspective is to identify, I guess I would say, the purpose. Are you trying to protect recreational lands? Are you trying to protect agricultural lands? What is some of the fundamental purposes for which that bond is going to be used? And we have seen in the past that what we've worked on with other communities is, okay, here is the general idea of the kind of areas that people want to see protected. For example, in Cache County, the agricultural value is huge, and that is what citizens are most interested in bonding for. Wow. So you can definitely say these are areas where you can apply this bond funding because it's agricultural land and there's the possibility of doing that. But I want to make it very clear that this is not in any way to say, well, we're going to go in and we're going to force that landowner to then go ahead and give us that land. That landowner has a private property right, whether they want to do it or not. But I will tell you that from what we've seen and the calls that we get on a daily basis, there is a lot of interest from landowners in wanting to conserve their land, wanting to be able to pass it on to the next generation. But the reality of the situation, as Steve mentioned, is there are very few funds out there. And on top of that, we can't even leverage those funds because we can't even apply for some of these sources. So very much that idea of the menu of options is something that you put together. And I am not here at all to advise you on how you would want to put that together, but I think one of the things that I have found instructive from the group that we have worked with in Wasatch County is that they have some really good ideas about what that menu of options should be. And I think that it might be worth kind of expanding or exploring on that with some of the county staff to figure out where is our money going to be best spent, or what are some areas of focus. Not even this landowner, that landowner, don't want to do that. But what are some areas of focus that really are challenged right now and that the community by and large cares about? And I'll add the other link in there that landowners are also interested in. Is this an area where if we applied some funding, landowners would come to the table? And I think, just based on the limited knowledge that I have, there are some areas in Wasatch County where landowners are interested, the community would like to see it preserved, and it makes sense to see potential funding that we can leverage 3 times over.
I've got a couple thoughts on that. With the way the prices are today on the value of the ground, let's just run some numbers. Councilman, good think about how much you think the bond ought to be for. Say if it were $5 million, you're able to triple that, and you have $15 million, that might buy 300 acres in the North Field.
No, now remember, we're not purchasing land.
Okay.
Just conservation easement, or?
Here's what I'm talking about. Do an example then. What do you think that would cost?
No, I mean, you're not talking about purchasing land, though. I mean, I don't think that's the goal. The goal, the way I understand it, and maybe everybody has their own opinion what the goal would be, is that we could purchase conservation easements, or we could purchase development rights.
Is there a rule of thumb of what you pay for something like that? Or that
There is not necessarily a rule of thumb of what you would pay for, and that's actually one of the things that I like about actually creating what the criteria is. In other words, if there's a landowner that is looking at benefiting from some of the donation value, maybe they go to the head of the class. So I'll give you an example in Rich County, where actually, believe it or not, the price per acre is $30,000 per acre in this particular piece of property. But the landowners have come at the approach of conserving the land from kind of the back end and said, you know, what we really want to do is we want to create some funding that ensures that we can hire a ranch manager if we have to in the future. So how much money do we have to have in order to generate the interest to go ahead and hire that ranch manager? So when you're talking about a situation like that, the $30,000 piece of property from market value becomes a $5,000 per acre conservation easement value. There are ways to calculate that. Anything from, if you look at the appraisal guidelines and the IRS guidelines, it's anywhere from 50 to 75, maybe even as much as 80 or 85% of the fair market value is what can essentially be paid for the conservation easement value. But I would like to urge...
Sorry, what was that percentage again?
Anywhere from 50, well, it actually can be down as far as 30. But typically what you see is about 50 to 85%
Of market value.
of
Who
market.
determines that?
That's done through a qualified appraisal.
But it still has to be willing seller of the conservation.
It definitely has to be a willing seller who's interested in doing this. And again, what you find is there are a couple of things that factor into it. For example, under the IRS code, an agricultural producer that qualifies can take 100% of their adjusted gross income against the value of the gift for 15 years. So when you start talking about math, I am not a mathematician, so I can't run those numbers for you. But essentially, you can see that there are a number of tools and techniques that you can do to maximize the benefit to the landowner, who is also recognizing that this is something that actually that they want to do. The bottom line is, if you're not interested in conserving your land, let's not put a conservation easement on it. Let's not go that direction. But if you are, there may be many more options available to you if there's a small amount of money. So I don't necessarily see this as a percentage of value of what the market is out there right now, because you're right. If we're paying a percentage of the market of what it is right now, you're probably not going to be able to afford it. But if there's a landowner who says, really what I want to do is I want to be able to retain the farm, and I want to be able to pass it on to the next generation, and I want to make sure that I have sort of something set aside so that never becomes a burden, and we can always hire a ranch person to come out and farm it and keep it moving from an agricultural perspective, that may be a very different equation than necessarily the percentage of the fair market value.
So, let's switch over to TDRs. I know we talked about for some time, and just curious about, from your perspective, your experience, have you ever seen them successful here in Utah?
That's a good question. I think that transfer of development rights is something that has to be looked at very, very carefully. And fundamentally, as you know, you have to have a sending area and a receiving area. And it really comes down to what is the underlying zoning in both of those areas. Because you're not going to get somebody to move from a sending area, in other words, the place that you want to protect, right? The reason you want to protect it is it's valuable and people think it's gorgeous and they want to be there. So the incentive has to be there in order to go to the receiving area. And so the question is, what is the fundamental zoning in both of those areas? If the fundamental zoning is already so high that it doesn't really bear out what the market is anyway, in other words, it's already multifamily development, then it's going to be able to create those incentives to take someone from a sending area and get them to be incentivized to go to a receiving area.
Have you seen it work anywhere?
Yes, actually I have. It has worked in San Luis Obispo.
In Utah? Have you seen it work in Utah?
There are a couple of places, I think, in the Salt Lake Valley that it has worked very, very successfully. That's what I've seen.
Well, we more or less came to the conclusion that we'll work here because the property values are too high.
Yeah, one thing that was nice with North Village is we could have done that all over again. Like 2 yards out of North Village and transfer them over to North Village, but we already gave it to them.
But, go back on this other one, where if you buy in the conservation easement, say it's 65% of the market value, then the property owner can also get a tax, by donating some of that, get a tax credit. That just about wipes out the capital gains tax. That in turn makes the net return to the property owner greater than if you just sold it out there.
Well, I'm going to actually say that, one, there is not a tax credit, it's a tax deduction, a tax donation that's being made. And I would actually say that one of the things I look at is if you are not interested in conserving your land, you probably should develop it. That's hard for me to say. I'm a conservationist, I've been doing this for 27 years. But if you don't have conservation in your heart, and this isn't something that you want to do to pass on to the next generation, you're always going to wonder whether or not you could have made more money if you went ahead and developed the property. So in order to do this, you have to really have as your starting goal the fact that what you want to do is conserve it. And the bottom line is that you can't get more for the value of that conservation easement than what the appraised value is. And the appraised value becomes, hopefully, in order to maximize leveraging from various different bond dollars or other sources of revenue, a combination between the donation that a landowner would make and the actual funds that would come in. And so at the end of the day, I will say, which I think is part of where you were going, Steve, is that the bottom line is you can end up in a situation where you've made a donation, but you haven't lost as much because you haven't also had to pay the taxes to the government.
Okay.
This is worked up in East Summit County, up in Chalk Creek, about the building Richard Farm, a ranch, and
With bond proceeds.
well,
Who bought it? Yeah, who bought it?
this East Summit County Land Conservation Group, and that's the county.
So they maintain it and
That's a great thing. So there's the Eastern Summit County Agricultural Preservation Fund that is actually funded out of some development taxes basically that have come forward to allow for agricultural preservation. And then those funds, similarly to what you're talking about here with respect to working on some sort of bond, and again, the rules of the road, they basically say, I will fund this much of it. And then they say, and it has to go to a qualified conservation organization. That can be a government entity, it can be an organization like Utah Open Lands, but fundamentally what you end up doing is the organization that ends up holding the conservation easement and oftentimes ends up bringing a percentage of the money to the table is the entity that monitors it on a yearly and more basis to make sure that the agreement that you all got to, the conservation easement, is adhered to by the landowner.
And the property owners up there are very skeptical of this at first. And then they make 2 transactions. Now there's a waiting list. That's probably only one to get on.
That's what happened at Summit.
Yeah, and we've seen that in a lot of different communities, because there are landowners, and again, I get calls on a regular basis, even calls from landowners in this county, who say, I want to protect this land and I want to find a way to pass it on to the next generation. And when they start looking at the market value of their property and how much they're going to have to pay in estate taxes, even with some of the generous estate tax trust funds that they can put together, they do look at it and they say, I don't know if I can actually pass this on to the next generation, or since I am land rich, cash poor, do I need to sell the land in order to afford to pay the taxes? And then in addition to that, you have complex family dynamics, which also add to this. There may be, you know, your son or your daughter or a couple of folks that want to continue to farm the land, but then there are others that don't, and they want to see some sort of value out of the property. So what a lot of landowners look at is this becomes the best of both worlds. They can pass this land on to the next generation, and they can also provide a small incentive for those who see this as maybe their inheritance. So from that perspective, you're right. See, we've seen actually a waiting list of people who want to see their land protected. And fundamentally, there is a benefit to the community. For every dollar in open space revenue that you get, even that land under Greenbelt, it actually only costs you as a county 35 to 65 cents. For every dollar in revenue that you get from residential development, it actually costs you between $1.35 and $1.65. These are studies that have been replicated throughout the nation, but that comes specifically from Utah State University and the Department of Agriculture. So what does that mean? Residential development tends to be a net drain. That's why we often get commercial development to set that, to help with that revenue. So what we see is that actually in protecting open space, it actually is a public benefit at the end of the day, because of course, as I like to say, the cows are not going to school. Thank you for laughing. I mean, I've been giving a lot of presentations today and nobody has caught any of my jokes, so I appreciate that.
Doug, how much, if someone does a development in Wasatch County, how much open space is required?
It varies, and
I understand it.
Yeah.
But as a general rule, if you're doing it, how much do we require?
20 to 30%, somewhere in that area.
How much, what's the percentage of land in Wasatch County that's federally or state or public land?
Probably going a little less than 80,
So it's like 70 something. 78%. That's
Actually 68%.
68. So right around 60. Okay.
To kind of get back to where it started, some of the questions that were